A sword hits plate armor. In Game of Thrones, it cuts through. The knight falls dead. The blade bounces off. The knight barely feels it. He keeps fighting. Hollywood showed you epic duels and instant kills. The Middle Ages gave you something else, stabbing through gaps in armor, fights that ended with daggers, not swords. Game of Thrones built a world millions believed was medieval. It wasn't, and the truth is stranger than anything they put on screen. George R.R. Scottish massacres that make the Red Wedding look restrained. But somewhere between history books and HBO, the truth disappeared. The combat was wrong. The castles were wrong. The religion was almost non-existent. Even the violence was exaggerated in some ways and sanitized in others. 5 things Game of Thrones got wrong, and why the real Middle Ages were darker, stranger, and more brutal than anything Westeros could offer. Let's start with the swords. In Game of Thrones, every fight is a dance. Blades clash, sparks fly. One clean strike and a man drops dead. Real medieval combat looked nothing like this. Swords could not cut through plate armor. You could swing a longsword at a knight in full plate, and the most you'd do is dent the metal. Maybe knock him off balance, but cut through. Impossible. Medieval fighters knew this. That's why they didn't aim for the chest. They aimed for the gaps, the armpits, the groin, the eye slits in the helmet. Places where steel didn't protect, and they didn't use elegant fencing moves. Grabbed their opponent and wrestled him to the ground, then pulled out a short dagger called a rondel and stabbed through the gaps while he struggled. There's another myth that real combat was short, brutal, and ugly. No choreography, no honor, just 2 men trying to find a gap in each other's armor before the other one did. And the tournament, nothing like the show. In Game of Thrones, jousting kills, knights die in the arena, lances punch through armor. The mountain crushes his opponent's skull in front of cheering crowds. Step into a real medieval tournament. The lances are blunted, the swords have no edge, because the entire point is that nobody dies. These were sporting events, not death matches. Knights competed for honor, prizes, and the attention of patrons. A tournament that regularly killed participants would run out of participants. The melees you see on screen, where dozens of knights hack at each other with sharpened steel. Fantasy. Real melees had rules, boundaries, judges, areas where defeated knights could retreat and catch their breath. Tournament deaths did occur, but they were rare enough to be recorded and remembered. Henry II of France died in a jousting accident in 1550. A splinter from a shattered lance pierced his eye. The death shocked Europe because it wasn't supposed to happen. Game of Thrones turned tournaments into blood sports. Real tournaments were closer to modern boxing. Violent yet dangerous sometimes, but designed to keep the competitors alive. Now here's something Game of Thrones almost completely erased. The church. In Westeros, the faith of the Seven exists. Characters mention it occasionally. A few fanatics show up in later seasons. But religion never shapes how people think or act. In real medieval Europe, this would be unthinkable. The Catholic Church wasn't just powerful, it was society itself. There was no separation of church and state. Kings ruled by divine right. Laws came from scripture. Going against the church wasn't rebellion, it was heresy. And heresy meant burning alive. Every person lived inside this system. It touched every birth, every marriage, every death, every meal. Real medieval people weren't like this. Heaven and hell were as real as the ground beneath their feet. A lord who broke church law didn't just risk his crown. This is why Westeros feels modern even though it looks ancient. The minds are 21st century. The morality is 21st century. Only the swords are old. Look at any castle in Game of Thrones. Grey stone, torchlight cutting through darkness. A world drained of color. Now forget everything you just saw. Real medieval castles were painted. Vibrant murals covered the walls. Colored stones decorated facades. Banners hung from every surface. Historians describe medieval stonework as fabulous. Not grim fortresses. Living spaces filled with color and noise. Even tavern walls had graffiti, crude drawings, messages, insults. Medieval people left their mark everywhere, just like we do. The forests were wrong too. Game of Thrones shows woodland you could ride through at full gallop. Real medieval forests were unmanaged. Branches so thick and low you could barely walk. Farmland looked nothing like the show. No neat fields, a chaotic patchwork of strips, different crops scattered everywhere, and wheat that grew 3 times taller than today. It towered over peasants as they worked. You couldn't see the person in the next row. Even the animals were different. Medieval sheep were so small a grown man could eat an entire one in a sitting. Game of Thrones gave us gray, grim, monochrome. Millions now believe that's what the Middle Ages looked like. The truth, medieval Europe was loud, colorful, and chaotic. A world that would look alien to us in ways HBO never imagined. But here's what they got right. And the truth is darker than the fiction. The Red Wedding, Robb Stark murdered at a feast. His mother, his pregnant wife, guests slaughtered by their hosts. It happened twice. November 1440, Edinburgh Castle. King James II of Scotland invited the 16-year-old Earl. Guards seized the brothers before they could reach their weapons. The 16-year-old Earl begged for mercy. The 10-year-old King James, sitting at the same table, pleaded for their lives. He was ignored. His own regents had planned this. They dragged the Douglas brothers to Castle Hill. A mock trial lasted minutes. The charges were treason. The evidence was invented. The verdict was never in doubt. Then the axe fell. Then it was his turn. Both heads rolled in the same courtyard where they'd been promised safe passage. The young king watched. He had no power to stop it. The men who ruled Scotland in his name had decided the Douglas clan would end that night. 4 centuries later, Sir Walter Scott wrote a poem about it. Edinburgh Castle, town and tower, God grant thou sink for sin. And that even for the black dinner, Earl Douglas got therein. 2 centuries later, Glencoe, 1692. Captain Robert Campbell arrived at Clan MacDonald's village with 120 soldiers. They needed shelter, they said. On the 13th night, orders arrived. Put all to the sword. Under 40 froze to death before morning. George R.R. Martin knew these stories. The Scots called it slaughter under trust. The Red Wedding wasn't invented, it was remembered. Game of Thrones loves its villains. Joffrey tortures for sport. Ramsay Bolton flays men alive. The Mountain crushes skulls with his bare hands. Real medieval rulers couldn't operate this way. When Richard III executed nobles without trial and rumors spread that he'd demurdered his nephews in the Tower of London, he wasn't feared, he was overthrown. Dead within 2 years of taking the crown. Medieval power ran on relationships. Lords needed vassals. Joffrey Baratheon would never have survived. A boy king who humiliated his court, who tortured people for entertainment. His own advisors would have poisoned him within months, not out of morality, out of survival. Hostages tell the same story. In the show, they're disposable. Kill them when convenient. In reality, killing a hostage destroyed you. Every future battle became a fight to the death because capture meant nothing. Medieval warfare depended on ransom. Knights surrendered because they expected to be treated well and released for gold. Slaughter your prisoners and that system collapses. Your wars become bloodbaths. Game of Thrones showed consequence-free violence. The real Middle Ages had rules. Break them, and everything broke with you. Swords that bounced off armor. A church that controlled every soul. Castles painted in colors we've forgotten. Massacres so brutal they inspired fiction 5 centuries later. And violence that always carried a price. Game of Thrones built a world that looked medieval but thought modern. The real Middle Ages were stranger, darker, and nothing like what HBO sold you. Next time, we go deeper. The methods designed to keep a person alive and screaming for days. The tools, the techniques, the reasons behind the cruelty. Subscribe so you don't miss it.